the world's largest nuclear arsenal, first to put a human in space, and by 1988, police were standing outside shops in Moscow, guarding soap. What broke this country wasn't a war, it was $17 on a barrel of oil. This story was reconstructed from documents by economist Yegor Gaidar. In September 1985, a barrel of oil cost $27. By April 1986, $10. From September 1985 to April 1986, 7 months, minus 63%. In Riyadh, this was strategy. In December 1985, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced, "We will no longer defend the price." The kingdom wanted its market share back. In Moscow, this was catastrophe. On March 4, 1986, the Politburo met to discuss emergency import cuts, the beginning of what Gaidar, citing declassified documents, calls currency panic. By year's end, the USSR had sold 206 tons of gold, a record, a distress signal, two capitals, two very different problems, one price chart that changed history. And the most frightening thing, in 1984, the head of Gosplan sent a memo. If oil drops below $20, we're done. The Politburo read it, filed it, and went back to discussing quotas for tractor production. What happened to that warning? You'll see when we reach the Politburo meeting of March 1986. Every dollar drop in oil price cost the USSR approximately $500 million per year in lost revenue. By March, the annual loss had already reached $6 to $7 billion compared to 1985. The USSR lived with a dual economy. Inside, the ruble and distribution. Outside, contracts, technology, and only hard currency. No socialism could replace dollars when you needed to buy extraction equipment, factory components, or what the USSR chronically lacked. When people say oil fed the USSR, that's not a metaphor. It's a hard production dependency. Currency from exports plugged the holes that the system itself couldn't mend. Soviet drilling rigs were 70% dependent on imported drill bits. No currency, no bits, extraction falls. The chemical industry needed Western catalysts. Without them, refineries produced garbage instead of gasoline. And in bad harvest years, the USSR bought up to 45 million tons of Canadian wheat. Medicines, pipes, machine tools. The list was endless. Everything required dollars. Remember those imported drill bits the USSR couldn't produce? Keep that in mind. By 1987, this dependency will start shutting down oil fields. When the Reagan administration in 1982 tried to block deliveries of large-diameter pipes for the Urengoy-Pomary-Uzhgorod gas pipeline, a quiet panic broke out in Moscow. The West showed it knew where the empire's weak spot was. There were warnings. In 1984, Nikolai Baibakov, head of Gosplan, sent a memo to the Politburo. If the price drops below $20, the budget won't balance. The memo was noted, filed away. While Moscow hoped for a miracle, OPEC was falling apart. By late 1985, at least 5 member countries were secretly exceeding their quotas. Everyone was trying to save their own budget and killing the price in the process. For the Soviet official responsible for imports, this became a nightmare. Without hard currency, technological chains inside the country began falling apart one after another. In a market system, a price drop triggers adaptation. In the Soviet system, the price fell, but nobody was allowed to admit the structure was broken. Imagine a car with a cracked engine. The driver's solution? Drive faster and hope nobody notices the smoke. When oil falls from $20 plus to single digits, the currency flow is cut in half. The authorities had to choose between bad and very bad, cut imports, stopping factories, or go into debt. But creditors don't give money to those who are losing revenue. The fall didn't start on its own. It needed a signal. And that signal came not from Moscow. It came from Riyadh, and possibly from Washington. What exactly was said, and why the USSR never recovered, that's next. In December 1985, while Moscow was still hoping to wait out the storm, an OPEC conference was taking place in Geneva that looked boring to an outsider. They weren't deciding the fate of ideologies there. They were deciding extraction volumes, discounts, contracts, and market share. But precisely such decisions in the commodity world replace artillery. They move prices, and prices move states. By December 1985, Saudi Arabia was playing the role of OPEC's stabilizer. On paper, the cartel was supposed to hold the price by limiting production. In practice, the scheme had been cracking for years. Some countries took on cuts, others violated quotas. When the price started falling, everyone was tempted to sell more to compensate for losses. And each of those extra barrels made the price even weaker. Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the legendary oil minister of Saudi Arabia, had spent 23 years, since 1962, persuading partners to observe quotas. But Yamani wasn't just an official. He was an architect of the oil era. A Harvard graduate, he had been shaping the kingdom's oil policy since 1962. It was he who organized the 1973 embargo against the U.S. and turned OPEC into a world power. It was he who made oil a political weapon. By the mid-'80s, Yamani was tired of being the guard who takes losses while others profit. His relationship with King Fahd was becoming increasingly tense. Yamani warned, if we start a price war, everyone will suffer. But by December 1985, the king had made a decision. Enough. The Saudis changed strategy. Instead of defending a high price, they began defending their market share. This meant one thing: flooding the world with cheap oil. Saudi Arabia stopped defending price as a political goal and started defending market share. The numbers tell the story. In 1985, Saudi Arabia was producing 3.6 million barrels per day. By January 1986, already 6 million. Those 2.4 million additional barrels every day crash the price. When the largest producer says, "I will no longer be the safety cushion," price becomes free fall. For Moscow, this was a blow to the gut. Low oil deprived the USSR of the ability to support allies and upgrade factories. But there was another dimension: foreign policy. This is where the topic of the U.S. and collusion appears. The visits of CIA Director William Casey to Saudi Arabia were first documented by journalist Bob Woodward in his 1987 book, Veil: The Secret Wars of the CIA, based on interviews with Casey himself. Former Reagan NSC advisor Roger Robinson later confirmed in interviews that the administration deliberately worked to reduce Soviet currency revenues. The formulation was elegant. The U.S. didn't ask the Saudis to crash the price. They simply made it clear they wouldn't object if Riyadh decided to reclaim its market share. The economy did the rest. Was this a conspiracy? Or just two players realizing they wanted the same thing? Think about that. We'll return to it at the end. The logic is simple. Low oil hits two groups of players: oil exporters who live on currency flow, and geopolitical adversaries of the U.S., for whom oil is the most important source of financial stability. The Soviet Union in the mid-'80s was squarely in the second category. Low oil meant for Moscow not just lower revenues, but fewer options. Less imports, less support for allies, less room to maneuver. This wasn't free for America. In 1986, hundreds of Texas oil companies went bankrupt. Tens of thousands lost jobs. Vice President Bush, himself a Texas oilman, flew to Riyadh in April to ask them not to drop the price too low. The Saudis listened politely and kept pumping. On October 29, 1986, Yamani was in his office when his phone rang. It wasn't the king. It was a journalist asking for comment on his dismissal. Yamani learned he was fired from the evening news. The man who had shaped world oil prices for 24 years wasn't even granted a goodbye meeting. This was a signal to everyone. Even architects of price wars aren't immune to their consequences. But for the USSR, this signal came too late. By October 1986, the currency crisis was already irreversible. After his dismissal, Yamani gave an interview. He had warned the king that a price crash would hit everyone. The king wanted to punish quota violators, and punish he did, at a price everyone paid. Yamani never returned to government. He spent the rest of his life giving interviews about what went wrong. Nobody in Riyadh listened, but what it cost the Soviet Union was far worse. We'll see the final price tag. Everyone at the table had a stake. Saudi Arabia wanted market share. The US wanted a weaker Moscow. The market wanted profit. Only the USSR had nothing, because the USSR wasn't at the table. It was on the menu. Everyone saw it coming. Nobody stopped it. That's how systems fail. Not from ignorance, but from paralysis. As soon as Saudi Arabia signaled it was ready to push with price, the fall became a process that accelerated itself. A price drop forces everyone to sell more to compensate, and that pushes the price down even harder. By early 1986, the price wasn't fluctuating. It was plummeting. And the real war wasn't in Afghanistan or at the border. It was in the numbers that appeared every morning in market reports. The mechanism of the crash was simple and merciless. First, an oil glut and discounts. Then, the destruction of expectations. When the market understood that the Saudis were no longer defending the price, it went into a nosedive. On April 7, 1986, Brent crude fell to $9.75 per barrel, a 12-year low. With production costs in Western Siberia estimated at $5 to $7 per barrel by Soviet oil ministry calculations of the period, the empire's margin of safety vanished. In 1986, the USSR for the first time in decades began mass-selling gold from reserves. Not because it wanted to profit, but because there wasn't enough currency even for current payments. The Kama automobile plant didn't receive Japanese CNC machines under a $120 million contract. Currency to pay for them wasn't found. The cabin production line stood idle for 11 months. Rizhkov mentions this in his memoirs. Kamaz wasn't the only victim. Atomash in Volgodonsk was waiting for German control systems for reactors. They never arrived. Moscow's Serpimolot plant purchased an Italian rolling line. It rusted in a warehouse for 3 years while they searched for currency for commissioning. In Tolyatti, new Zhiguli models were postponed because there was no money for licenses. By 1988, the newspaper Pravda was running exposés on shadow currency operations at state enterprises. Factory directors began doing what had previously been unthinkable, signing barter deals directly with foreign firms, bypassing Venezia-Bank entirely. Some directors negotiated equipment for product swaps without going through central planning. This was the first sign that the system was starting to unravel. Creditors, seeing an empty treasury, began setting humiliating conditions. The superpower's external authority was collapsing not in battle, but in the ledgers of Western banks. When the gold started running out, the USSR began doing what it had never done: begging. Gold was sold through Venezia-Bank on the London market. They did it quietly, in batches, so as not to crash the price, but the market saw everything. When a major seller starts dumping reserves, it's a signal. Things are bad. In 1985, the USSR's gold reserves stood at 719 tons. By 1991, 240 tons. In 6 years, the empire sold 2/3 of its gold, and it wasn't enough. What happens when even the gold runs out? You'll see exactly how that looked. Western bankers sensed weakness. Loan terms became tougher and tougher. If at the beginning of the 80s the USSR could borrow at 1 to 2% above market rates, by the end of the decade the spread had grown to 3 to 4%. Creditors were pricing in default risk. The empire that had lectured the world was now paying a premium for distrust. But numbers are an abstraction. What was happening on the ground? In 1987, sugar shortages began in Moscow. Then soap. By 1988, ration cards appeared for tea and tobacco. Things that had been ordinary for decades were turning into scarcity. People stood in lines for 3 to 4 hours. A new ritual emerged. Someone would take a place in line at 5 in the morning, then they'd take turns, writing the number on their hand. In some cities, fights broke out in lines. Police had to guard stores selling soap. The word vibrisili, they threw out, became the main verb of consumption. Not their selling, but threw out, as if goods appeared randomly and briefly. Anger accumulated. People saw empty shelves and empty promises. They didn't know about oil prices or currency reserves. They knew one thing: yesterday was better than today. This knowledge, and what it did to loyalty, becomes the key to understanding the collapse. For decades, the USSR had built an image of self-sufficiency. It told the world it didn't need bourgeois markets. But in the mid-80s, it turned out that precisely the bourgeois oil market could cut off its oxygen. A country that was the first to send a human to space now couldn't buy bearings for its machine tools. Because the market said, pay first. What does a government do when the money runs out? It does what the Politburo did: holds more meetings, launches more campaigns, blames more saboteurs. Activity without action. The feeling of control without actual control. The oil crash did two things simultaneously. It struck at currency, that's obvious, but it also changed the behavior of the system from the inside. It accelerated elite conflicts, made reforms riskier, deprived the government of the ability to buy stability with imports and subsidies. That is, oil didn't just reduce revenues. It changed the rules of the game inside the country itself. But all of this, the gold sales, the empty shelves, the lines, started with one meeting, one room. One day when the Politburo looked at the numbers and realized, this isn't a bad quarter. This is the end of the model. Let's go back to March 4th, 1986. On March 4th, 1986, the Politburo stopped pretending. This wasn't a collection of unpleasant news anymore. This was a decision. What can we still pay for? And what do we cut? Financial wars become visible not in newspaper headlines, but in offices where numbers are placed on the table. At that meeting, Nikolai Ryzhkov, chairman of the Council of Ministers, reported, "At the current oil price, currency reserves cover obligations for only 4 to 5 months. Gosplan head Nikolai Baibakov proposed cutting equipment imports by 20%. Gorbachev demanded to find internal reserves, but there were no reserves." Nikolai Ryzhkov described this meeting in his memoirs, 10 Years of Great Upheavals. He presented the numbers, and the room went quiet. According to Ryzhkov, Gromyko said nothing throughout. Ligachev proposed mobilizing the workers. Gorbachev, as Ryzhkov wrote, kept demanding internal reserves, but Ryzhkov had none to offer. The problem wasn't that nobody knew what to do. The problem was that all options led to political losses. Cutting imports meant admitting failure to the people. Borrowing from the West meant admitting failure to the world. Increasing production. But the fields were already working at capacity, and new ones required those very technologies for which there was no currency. In the end, they made a decision that decided nothing: strengthen the regime of economizing currency funds and accelerate work on import substitution. These were words, but currency kept draining every day. Remember Baibakov's 1984 memo? Here's what happened to it. The memo reached the Politburo. It was read. It was filed. And nothing was done, because acknowledging the risk meant acknowledging that the entire system depended on something Moscow couldn't control: the world oil price. 2 weeks after the meeting, the oil price fell by another $1, then more. By April, the Politburo was meeting in firefighting mode. They thought this was the crisis. They were wrong. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at Chernobyl exploded. The cleanup required resources that didn't exist anyway. By various estimates, direct costs amounted to $18 to $20 billion, more than the entire annual oil export after the price collapse. Evacuation, the sarcophagus, compensation, healthcare, all of this fell on a budget that was already cracking. 2 blows in 1 year. The oil crash deprived the country of currency. Chernobyl demanded currency that didn't exist. This isn't just bad luck. This is the perfect storm. The system could have survived either of these catastrophes. Both together, no. The climax of 1986 didn't produce an instant finale. It produced something else. It changed the trajectory. After this, the crisis couldn't be talked away. It could only be lived through, either deepening contradictions or trying to cure them with reforms that themselves were breaking the old structure. After 1986, the most dangerous thing wasn't the oil price drop itself, but how it restructured the behavior of everyone inside the system. This is the answer to the question we left open. The oil blow turned out to be fatal, not because the country became poorer, but because the country lost the ability to buy stability and time. And along with that, the logic of government, elites, and society changed. Currency revenues from oil and gas collapsed. In 1984, it was $22 billion. In 1986, already $13 billion. By 1988, only $11 billion remained. Imports shrank. Shelves began emptying. According to Cuban sources, in 1987, Cuba received 2 million tons less oil than expected. Fidel Castro was furious. Moscow could no longer buy loyalty. Cuba was just the beginning. Since the 1960s, Vietnam, Mongolia, Ethiopia, Angola, Nicaragua, all these countries had received Soviet oil at $8 to $12 per barrel when market price was $20 plus, often in exchange for political loyalty and military bases. When the flow shrank, allies began looking around. Vietnam leaned toward China, Ethiopia toward the West. By 1989, Cuba was rationing electricity. Castro blamed the Americans. But he knew the empire was losing its periphery not because it was losing the war of ideas. It was losing the war of money. In June 1987, Gorbachev passed the law on state enterprises. The idea: give factories freedom. The result: factory directors got the right to keep profits and started hoarding goods, waiting for prices to rise. By 1989, the shortage became catastrophic. The medicine was killing the patient. Remember those imported drill bits? By 1988, oil extraction in western Siberia had plateaued. New fields required new technology that required currency that no longer existed. The vicious circle closed. In 1988, the head of Vneshekonombank, Viktor Gerashenko, flew to Deutsche Bank for loans. The gold was running out. By 1990, the begging reached the top. That year, Gorbachev flew to Bonn. The official agenda: German reunification. But according to Kohl's memoirs and declassified Bundesarchiv documents, Gorbachev spent significant time discussing Soviet requests for financial assistance. The quid pro quo was clear: money for consent to reunification within NATO. The leader of a superpower was now a supplicant, explaining to the German chancellor why the USSR needed loans. Everyone in the room knew it. Kohl listened politely and helped, but on his own terms. 45 years after the war, the defeated were lending money to the victors. The Germans gave loans, 5 billion marks in 1990, then more. In return, consent to German reunification within NATO. The empire was selling geopolitical positions because it couldn't pay for grain imports. Yamani warned that a price war would hurt everyone. The final cost for the USSR, 2/3 of gold reserves, half of its allies, and eventually, the country itself. This was the end. Not a loud one, not with tanks and flags. A quiet end in negotiating rooms where payment schedules and restructuring terms were discussed. Accounting defeated ideology. By 1991, external debt had grown from $28 billion to $67 billion. Debt grew, but the ability to pay vanished. Oil was the currency tap. In 1986, that tap was sharply turned off. And at that moment, the USSR found itself in the position of an empire that could still demonstrate power, but could no longer pay for its consequences. This is how empires die, not from bullets, but from bookkeeping. We started with a simple and provocative thesis. Oil killed the USSR. Now we can say it more precisely and honestly. The oil crash of 1986 wasn't the only cause of the collapse, but it became the blow that deprived the Soviet Union of the most valuable resource in a crisis: currency and time. And when a system runs out of currency and time, it stops choosing a future. It starts choosing what to cut first. The USSR is often described as a story about ideology, leaders, intrigues, reforms, and protests. This is a convenient version because it sounds dramatic, but it hides the main thing. The empire was held up by an external circuit that was paid for by oil. When the oil price crashed, the currency tap was turned off, and inside the country, a chain reaction began. Imports shrank. Scarcity became sharper. Trust became thinner. Elites became harsher. Allies became more cautious. And at some point it turned out that the old order wasn't a system, but a habit that was held together by money. Remember those lines, those ration cards, that word throughout? People didn't understand currency reserves, but they understood a broken promise. The Soviet social contract was simple. We give you stability, you give us loyalty. When the shelves emptied, so did the loyalty. And no amount of ideology could fill that gap. Yegor Gaidar, in his book Collapse of an Empire, proved it was precisely this currency shock that became the point of no return. World empires no longer fall only under the blows of weapons. They fall when their financial circuit stops sustaining reality. Tanks without currency are metal. Missiles without technology are the past. Propaganda without the ability to provide basic things is noise. And a state that lives on a single export tap is always vulnerable to those who can change the price or volume. The USSR in 1986. Oil dropped 63%. Currency revenues dropped 40% within 2 years. Venezuela in 2014 to 2020. Oil dropped 70%. GDP dropped 65%. The math is almost identical. The mechanism hasn't changed. But as soon as the price makes a move down, you'll see the same thing you saw in this story. Elite disputes, harsh measures, searching for someone to blame, attempts to maintain control. Because this isn't a story about the USSR. This is a story about dependence. And dependence always ends the same way, until the next country learns it the hard way. The question for the comments is simple but controversial. What do you think? Was the oil crash of 1986 more of a deliberate geopolitical move or an inevitable market price war? Where, in your view, does the line run between conspiracy and convergence of interests? If you want to understand how money and resources actually change the world map, subscribe. In the next story, we'll examine another example where not an army decided the outcome, but a financial lever, and one number turned victory into defeat.